Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. I know you're looking at this title and wondering who could have possessed the most hated title, because throughout history, this title has certainly changed hands. Madalyn Murray O'Hair was once known as the most hated woman in America. Who is Madalyn Murray O'Hair? I am so glad you asked. You always ask all the right questions. She was prominently known as the most famous atheist, who was responsible for abolishing prayer in public schools in 1963, where she took her case to the Supreme Court and won. The lawsuit was known as Murray versus Curlett, which found prayer in public schools unconstitutional. She wasn't always an atheist, though. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and when she was 4, she was baptized into the Presbyterian Church. Her mother was Lutheran, so one can assume that she had participated in some church activities as a child. As she got older, she grew away from the church and into her current beliefs. In 1941, Madalyn married a man named John Henry Roths, who worked as a steelworker, where both he and Madalyn had enlisted in World War II, with John in the Marines and Madalyn in the Women's Army Corps. As time went on, they did separate. While posted in Italy in 1945, Madalyn had a relationship with a man named William Murray Jr., who was actually already married, and as a Roman Catholic, he refused to divorce his wife. I guess he drew the line at divorce and not having an affair. But anyway, she became pregnant by William and ended up having a son, which she named William after him, nicknamed Bill, when she had returned home after the war. Following the finalization of Madalyn's divorce to John Roths, she then changed her name to Madalyn Murray. Madalyn attended Ashland University in Ohio in 1949, completing her bachelor's degree, then moving to Houston, Texas to attend South Texas College of Law. However, she did not end up passing the bar exam. It's hard, y'all. A few years later, in 1954, she and her boyfriend, Michael Fiorello, welcomed a son named John Garth Murray, who went by his middle name Garth. We do have another John in the story, so we will be referring to John Garth Murray as Garth from this point on. According to Madalyn's older son, Bill, she was a socialist who showed sympathy towards the Soviet Union and would frequently host Socialist Labor Party meetings. Bill had also claimed that she sought to deflect to the Soviet Union by applying in 1959 through the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C., and again in 1960 through the embassy in Paris. Both places denied her entry. After returning back to the United States from Paris, Madalyn went with Bill to re-enroll at the local middle school and saw that students were engaging in instructed prayer. She did not like this. She had Bill keep a record of all the times students were praying or engaged in religious exercises. After 2 weeks, she had requested that Bill be allowed to leave class during instructed prayer times, which was denied by school authorities. Her response to this was to pull him out of school. It was then that she had filed the lawsuit against the Baltimore public school system, going as far as to name Bill as the plaintiff. She said that practices of mandatory prayer were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court upheld her position by ruling in her favor in 1963. At the same time, Bill's girlfriend Susan had run away from home and was staying with the Murrays. When the police had been called by Susan's parents to retrieve her and bring her back to her parents' home, Madalyn was alleged to have assaulted 5 police officers who tried to take Susan away. Susan was pregnant at the time and had a daughter she named Robin. Robin was later adopted by Madalyn. Because of how known the family was at that time due to the attention brought on by the court case, the family faced growing hostility in Baltimore, so Madalyn and her sons moved to Hawaii later that year. In 1965, Madalyn married a Marine named Richard O'Hair. She then added O'Hair to her name and would continue to go by the surname Murray O'Hair for the rest of her life. Richard O'Hare led quite the interesting life. During the 1940s, he had belonged to a communist group in Detroit, and during investigations in the 1950s, gave more than 100 names of other members to the FBI. Shortly after that, Richard was investigated for falsely claiming to be an FBI agent. Richard and Madeline had separated, however, remained legally married and friendly until Richard's death in 1978. The family had frequently moved around, eventually settling in Texas. During her time in Texas, she founded the organization American Atheists, as well as a magazine that was heavy on the separation of church and state. She was also a frequent contributor to Hustler magazine, writing many articles for them. She was known to be a very difficult woman to be around and to work with. She had a lot of thoughts and strong opinions that many people, including myself, did not agree with. She was known to speak her mind with little regard to other people's feelings. One morning in August of 1995, Madeline disappeared along with her son Garth and granddaughter Robin without having said a word to anyone. The only information that the employees of the American Atheist organization had was a note that was attached to the front door of the office that said Madeline and her family had been called away on an emergency and didn't know when they would return. Both Garth and Robin worked for her, so it wouldn't be completely out of the ordinary for the three of them to travel together. Missing along with them was Garth's Mercedes and Robin's Porsche. If you were called out of town, I wouldn't think too much about the cars being gone. Like, how are you supposed to leave? If they were called out of town, of course they would take their cars, right? Curious though, that all three of their passports were left behind. Okay, so maybe they weren't leaving the country. Concerningly, Madeline, a diabetic, had left behind all of her diabetes medication, as well as her three beloved dogs. She wasn't a fan of people, but she really loved her dogs. One of the board members, Ellen Johnson, who is now the president of the organization, repeatedly tried to make contact with Madeline, Garth, and Robin, just trying to find out where they were. She had called Garth's cell phone many times, and eventually Madeline picked up. Ellen asked where they were, but Madeline wouldn't tell her anything. Ellen said that the few subsequent phone calls were short and strained, and she was suspicious and worried that the family were possibly under distress. Ellen was eventually able to get Garth back on the phone again and pressed him for information because she was very concerned for their safety. Garth said that she didn't have to worry and that everything was okay. He said what he had to say to reassure her, and eventually Ellen was like, okay, fine, I believe you. About a month later, Madeline and Garth both stopped answering their phones. Ellen then took over Madeline's duties at the American Atheists group, and one day while going through the company's accounts, she discovered that $600,000 was missing from the company's main account. All of the American Atheist Organization's members were very concerned, but apparently not concerned enough to file a police report until almost a year later. I don't know if they thought that the police wouldn't help them or what their reasoning was to continue to allegedly be concerned, but not say anything for over a year. It was actually Madeline's son Bill, who was estranged from her at the time, that had filed the missing persons report on his mother, brother, and daughter. Bill and his mother had been estranged for quite some time. Bill had told his mother on Mother's Day in 1980 that he was no longer an atheist and that he had embraced Christianity. This infuriated Madeline. He later went on to write a book where he attacked his mother's atheist beliefs, as well as a film where he stated that he was used as an accomplice in her schemes. He said that she had instructed him to keep a record whenever there was prayer or Bible reading while he was a student at public school, He also said that his mother made him a spy for the cause of atheism. Immediately after its release, Madeline had disowned him, and Bill reportedly never spoke with his mother, brother Garth, and daughter Robin ever again. When asked about his mother, brother, and daughter's disappearance, he said he didn't know if there was foul play involved or if his family had simply just run off with the organization's money and disappeared on purpose. Even after Bill had reported his mother, brother, and daughter missing, Austin police showed little interest. In fact, there was no investigation done by the police department. None. It was thought by the police department that Madeline and her family had just taken the atheist organization's money and run off. To them, this was an internal matter. A newspaper reporter named John MacCormack, who was researching the case, was able to get a hold of Garth's phone records and found that he had seemingly been living in San Antonio in the days and weeks after the family's disappearance. He found that over 200 phone calls had been made during that time, and many of them were suspicious. John had found that some of the phone calls were made to financial institutions, like banks, trusts, and jewelry stores. They had also called several pharmacies to get Madeline's medication for her diabetes, and had made several calls to airlines. This might indicate that they were potentially planning to travel abroad for an extended period of time. Remember, they had left their passports behind, so they probably wouldn't get too far. John was able to track down some of the jewelry stores that were called and found that they were located in San Antonio. While speaking with the owner of one of the jewelry stores, John had found that Garth Murray had purchased almost $600,000 worth of gold coins, paying in cash. A reporter from ABC's Nightline named Valerie Williams was perplexed that someone as famous and well-known as Madeline had just gone missing with a very large sum of money, and no one was looking for her. This was all very suspicious. And since the police had no interest in pursuing any leads, Valerie decided that she'd take matters into her own hands. While looking into the disappearance further, Valerie had found out that Garth had sold his Mercedes for $15,000, far below its value. Remember, his car and Robin's Porsche were both unaccounted for, and it was thought that the family had driven off in them. Now, to find out that he sold it for significantly undervalue, they wanted to speak with the person who bought it. Valerie and the rest of her team at Nightline had found out that the car was sold to a man named Mark Sparrow. Mark said that a man identifying himself as Garth Murray had sold him the car, but when investigators showed him a picture of Garth Murray, he was like, "Nope, not him. Never seen him before. That's not the guy who sold me my car." Mark was then presented with a series of mugshots to go through and eventually stopped on someone he recognized. It was a picture of a man named Danny Fry. Danny Fry was an ex-con who was also a missing person. Danny's family had said that Danny was working with another ex-con named David Waters, and get this, David Waters once worked with Madeline O'Hare as her office manager in 1993, but ended up being fired 6 months later after Madeline had alleged he stole upwards of $50,000 from the organization. Was this a coincidence or a very strong lead? Let's see. After being charged with theft, David accepted a plea and agreed to pay the money back. Because he had paid the money back, he was not sentenced to any jail time, and because of this, Madeline was furious. She couldn't believe that the police would let him go free. She wrote an article in her magazine describing David as a thief and implied that he had homosexual relations while in prison for an earlier assault conviction. When David found out about the article, he vowed to get revenge. John MacCormack had felt that this was an exceptionally strong lead and had then called David to ask if he had anything to do with the disappearance of Madeline, Garth, and Robin. David said that he had nothing to do with it. John didn't believe a word he said. Looking more into David Waters, John had found out that, along with Danny Fry, David was known to work with another ex-con named Gary Carr in Austin, Texas, around August 1995, which, if you recall, was the same time the O'Hares went missing. Shortly after, a very disturbing discovery was made in a Dallas river. The torso of a man was found, and his head and hands were missing. The discovery took police over 3 years to identify because, on top of not having a missing persons report, they didn't have the teeth to match with the dental records. They had no hair to test, they had no hands, so no way of testing and matching fingerprints. John MacCormack deep down believed that this body had something to do with the O'Hares. Forensic anthropologists had estimated the man to be between the ages of 35 and 45. He was of a stocky build and notably had a large amount of chest hair. This description did not match Garth Murray, but it might match someone else. Like, yes, obviously it's someone else. Thank you, Christine. John had told police that he believed this man could be Danny Fry. He was the man identified as impersonating Garth Murray when he was selling the car, and if you remember, he was missing too. Danny Fry's brother provided investigators with a DNA sample that was then compared with the blood DNA found on the torso. It was a match. This man was Danny Fry. In his article, John had written that the man was identified as Danny Fry. He wrote that he was last seen hanging around David Waters in Austin. Also, he was known to be in San Antonio during the time the O'Hares went missing. All of a sudden, guess who's interested? If you said literally everyone, you'd be correct. All of a sudden, local, state, and federal agents took an interest and just then began their investigation. Wow, thank you so much for doing this in such a timely manner. Anyway, a woman named Patty Steffen read about David Waters in the newspaper, and she immediately called the FBI. She was David's ex-girlfriend and said that 3 years earlier, David had rented a storage unit in San Antonio right around the time the O'Hares went missing. Initially, she was hesitant about giving up information and only told police bits and pieces. She was scared of David and felt that talking to the authorities would make her a target. She reluctantly told them that David had once gone to the storage unit with a canister of bleach. Bleach is sometimes used to remove blood. Why would there be blood in your storage unit? Did you step on something? You didn't step on anything. You're trying to clean up something bad. Police were able to quickly get a search warrant for the storage unit and found under a piece of aluminum at the base of the wall a tiny red stain. They knew why this tiny stain might have been missed. It was so tiny it was almost invisible. Police matched this sample along with a sample from Madeline's other son, Bill, and the mitochondrial test revealed that the stain contained a mixture of 2 people. They were Madeline Murray O'Hare and her son, John Garth Murray. When the FBI went to search David's apartment, they found documents belonging to the O'Hares that had been dated after David was fired as Madeline's office manager. Police had obtained a search warrant in order to search David and his girlfriend's apartment, where they found 118 rounds of ammunition of different calibers. Because David was a convicted felon, and the terms of his release did not permit him to own guns or ammunition, he was arrested and police seized more contents of the apartment. Also found was a bow saw and several books from the O'Hare's library. During this time in Walled Lake, Michigan, Gary Carr was contacted and interviewed by police. Gary was not cooperative. Are you surprised? He had spent the last 30 years in prison for kidnapping a judge's daughter and had no interest in speaking with them. He just sat quietly with his arms crossed. He had asked to listen to the details being discussed about the case and had his rights read to him. After listening in, Gary decided to talk. He had implicated David Waters in the deaths of the O'Hares. Gary had signed an affidavit and had drawn police a map where they could find the bodies. A search of Gary's home had uncovered 2 firearms, which led to his arrest. He remained in Detroit, Michigan, awaiting trial. After the weapons charge was dismissed, Gary was then transferred into the custody of U.S. Marshals in Austin to be tried for the death of the O'Hares. When confronted with the forensic and physical evidence against him, 5.5 years after the O'Hares' disappearance, David had agreed to lead investigators to the remote burial site in Camp Wood, Texas. In January 2001, after he had pled guilty to conspiracy, David had led investigators to the ranch in Texas where he had buried their bodies. After 21 hours of excavation, the skeletons of 3 adult bodies were uncovered. When the site was excavated, they found that the legs of all 3 victims had been cut off with a saw. The remains were severely decomposed at this point, but all 3 identities were confirmed through dental records. One of the bodies had a shiny piece of metal, easily determined to be an artificial hip, which, when investigators ran the serial number, came back belonging to Madeline Murray O'Hare, when she had had a hip replacement surgery several years earlier at Breckenridge Hospital in Austin. It was noted that on one of the bodies found, the hair was still very well intact and was still braided, later identified as Robin. Fragments of clothing were found at the scene, but no clothes were intact. Several of the bones uncovered had evidence suggesting they were burned in an effort to remove any DNA evidence and make it so they were unidentifiable. When excavators were uncovering Garth, there was a plastic bag found over his head. When the bag was removed, there was evidence of blunt force trauma to his head due to several small fractures. When looking at the bones belonging to Madeline and Robin, investigators were unable to determine a cause of death, but because of the presence of bags over their heads, it was assumed they were asphyxiated. While digging in the surrounding area, excavators uncovered an extra head and 2 hands. The head had a single gunshot wound at the base of the skull. While using a photo superimposition technique, scientists were able to identify the skull as belonging to Danny Fry. Based on previous testimony from Patty, David's ex-girlfriend, she said that David had kidnapped the O'Hares because of the article Madeline had written about him in her magazine, and said that he fantasized about torturing her. After kidnapping the family, David had forced Garth to withdraw $600,000 from the company's account, which he then made him exchange for gold coins. It is believed that the O'Hares were already dead when Danny pretended to be Garth in order to sell his car. So we have concluded that the O'Hares murder was revenge, but why was Danny Fry murdered? David had told Danny's brother Bob that Danny has a big mouth, and when he drinks, he spills. It is thought that Danny's heavy drinking and unpredictable mouth contributed to his murder. At the trial, prosecution focused on David Waters, a convicted felon that had a previous violent history and was a former employee of the American Atheists organization. David had pleaded guilty to stealing over $54,000 from the organization, and not long after the theft was discovered, Madeline had published an article in the American Atheist newsletter which stated David's crime, as well as claiming that when he was 17, he had killed another teenager. Following the previous conviction, he had spent 8 years in prison. It was concluded by police, as well as agents from the FBI and IRS, that David Waters, along with Gary Paul Carr and Danny Fry, had kidnapped the O'Hares, forced them to withdraw money, later killing and dismembering them. The three men then went on to spend the money on gold coins, as well as making several purchases with credit cards belonging to the O'Hares. Just a few days after the murder of the O'Hares, David and Gary had killed Danny, removing his head and his hands, leaving his body in the riverbed. Because of the condition that he was left in, he was unable to be identified for more than 3.5 years. After a 3-week trial, Gary Carr was found guilty of conspiracy to commit extortion, traveling interstate in order to commit violent acts, money laundering, and interstate transportation of stolen property. All of these charges were directly related to the O'Hare case. He had been previously acquitted of conspiracy to kidnap the O'Hares because their bodies had not yet been located. In August of 2000, Gary Carr was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. David Waters had been arrested and was prosecuted. In a plea agreement on the charge of conspiracy, David had agreed to lead police to the bodies of the O'Hares. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He did not go to trial for the kidnapping and murder of the O'Hares, as far as I can tell, because of his plea in which he agreed to lead investigators to the bodies, which was essentially his admission of guilt. He was also ordered to pay back $543,665 to the American Atheist Organization and to the estates of Madeline Murray O'Hare, John Garth Murray, and Robin Murray. John Waters died of lung cancer on January 27, 2003, at the Federal Medical Center in North Carolina, where he was serving his sentence. The debts he owed were never paid due to David being in prison and not being able to work before his passing. It might provide you with some solace that after David had stolen the $600,000, the coins that it was exchanged for was stolen from him. He left it all in a storage unit in Austin, where a few guys were going around and opening up units with a master key, looking for TVs and small electronics like that, and found a suitcase full of gold. They had taken the gold coins and, with the help of friends, exchanged them for cash. They then went to Las Vegas and partied for the weekend. All of the coins had been exchanged and spent, except for one coin that was given to one of the thieves' aunt as a pendant. The last coin had been recovered by the FBI after a 1999 Memorial Day public appeal. Honestly, wow, what a story. What do you think about how this case was handled or not handled by police? Do you think justice was served? I can go back and forth. I have linked below the John MacCormack article that I have referenced several times in this video, and I encourage you to take a look at it if you are at all interested in further researching this case. Whew. Thank you for sticking with me. I know this was a long one, I think. I don't know. Let's see how I edit it. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Are people doing fireworks? Happy Thanksgiving. Let's set off some fireworks.